Video 9 of Prolonging the Agony. America enters, and the world is remade. By 1917, the war in Europe was already lost in everything but name. Millions were dead, empires were hollowed out, and yet this was not the end. Because this war was no longer about victory. It was about what kind of world would emerge afterward. America's entry into the First World War is usually told as a moral awakening, a reluctant republic drawn into the conflict to save democracy and make the world safe for peace. But that story is a myth. In this episode, we look behind the speeches, behind the slogans, and behind the carefully cultivated image of American innocence. We examine how U.S. entry locked in the outcome of the war, not just on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table where borders were drawn, promises were broken, and entire regions were quietly traded away. We'll dismantle the Wilsonian myth, the idea that ideals, not interests, guided America into the war, and we'll trace how wartime diplomacy in the Middle East became a master class in double dealing. The same land promised simultaneously to Arabs, Europeans, and a future colonial order, all under the banner of liberation. What emerges is not a story of accident or confusion, but of design. Chapter 27. American Mythology. He kept us out of the war. Chapter 27 dismantles the popular myth that the United States entered World War I reluctantly or by accident. In 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." Despite the authors arguing that American neutrality had long been compromised, the election was razor thin, hinging on California, and Wilson privately acknowledged that Britain and France supported his re-election, while Germany favored his opponent. Publicly, Wilson spoke of peace without victory, but within months he reversed course and asked Congress to declare war. The chapter questions the official explanations, such as the Zimmerman telegram or submarine warfare, arguing that neither American shipping losses nor casualties justified entry into a world war. Instead, the authors point to Wall Street and Allied debt as the decisive factor. Major American financial institutions, particularly those tied to J.P. Morgan, had extended enormous loans to Britain and France. The Allies lost. The American financial system itself faced collapse. Influential newspapers, shaped by public opinion, while political pressure mounted behind the scenes. In April 1917, Wilson signed sweeping war finance legislation that protected the banking system and unleashed the Federal Reserve's lending power, effectively guaranteeing profits while socializing risk. According to the authors, the decision for war was not driven by outrage or idealism, but by economic necessity. The chapter concludes that America entered the war not because it was attacked, but because the cost of peace had become unacceptable to financial power. The slogan endured, but the reality was buried. And in fact, initially, so few people signed up to join the war that they had to pass the draft, showing just how unpopular the war was. Chapter 27 argues that America didn't enter the war for freedom, but because Wall Street could not afford an Allied defeat. Chapter 28. The Balfour Declaration. Mythhistory. Chapter 28 challenges the historical narrative surrounding the Balfour Declaration, arguing that it rests on layers of myth, selective memory, and wartime political maneuvering. The authors begin by noting that several Jewish and Israeli historians have questioned the traditional language used to frame Jewish history. Terms like exile, diaspora, and return, arguing that these concepts are often treated as historical fact despite weak or disputed evidence. It becomes crucial here to quote directly from the book itself. The distinguished Israeli historian Shlomo Sand risked more than his reputation when, in 2008, he published his re-examination of Jewish history to expose the conventional lies about the past, which, like all historical misrepresentations, served to justify the traditional narrative, which the elites have constructed to protect their primacy. He challenged the orthodox views from the authorized agents of memory, who had steadfastly denied any deviation from the received version of Jewish history. What a wonderful phrase, the authorized agents of memory, the voice of those, and only those, whose research and writings are accepted as truth. Professor Sand has since been shunned by establishment and Zionist historians, and castigated because he refused to use terms like the Jewish people, ancestral lands, exile, diaspora, Eretz Israel, or land of redemption, which were key terms in the mythology of Israel's national history. His refusal to employ them was held to be heretical. Shlomo Sand was not alone in such protests. Those of us born into the Christian traditions were taught Bible stories in school or at church, perhaps even from our parents. In the two-part theological litany of events, the Bible, as recorded by whom we will never know, the Old Testament was accepted as a history of the Jewish people despite a complete lack of evidence on which to base key assertions. Take, for instance, the claim that the Jewish people were dispersed into exile by the Romans. Nowhere in the vast and well-documented records of the Roman Empire is there historical proof of a large refugee population around the borders of Judea after the three uprisings or wars in the 1st century, as there would have been if a mass flight had taken place. Some Jews may have fled fearing for their lives, but the Roman conquerors did not enforce an exile. There was no imperial edict. Another Israeli historian, Adia Haran, insisted that there was no truth in the claim that an exile occurred after the destruction of the temple, when the emperors Titus and Hadrian supposedly expelled the Jews from Palestine. He too agreed that this idea, based on historical ignorance, derived from a hostile fabrication by the fathers of the Christian Church, who wanted to show that God punished the Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus. The myth of uprooting and exile was fostered by the Christian legend, from which it flowed into Jewish tradition and grew to be the accepted truth engraved in history. More recently, the Israeli historian Ilan Pape, professor at Exeter University, has attacked the foundational mythologies of Israeli history, which insist that Palestine was a land without a people, waiting on a people without a land. This isn't just bad history, it is patently wrong. In 1976, Arthur Koestler, a Hungarian-born naturalized British citizen of Jewish parentage, demonstrated another misconception in his remarkable book, The 13th Tribe. The ancient Ashkenazim Jews, who comprise most of the world's population of Jews today, sprang from barbarians living in the ancient empire of Khazaria between the Caspian and the Black Seas. In his masterpiece of world history, The Silk Roads, Peter Frankopan, director of the Center for Byzantine Research at Oxford University, also explained the spread of Judaism in the 9th century when the Khazars chose to convert en masse, which raised speculation that they might be one of those lost tribes of ancient Israel. Not so. Many of these Jewish converts migrated to what is today Poland and Russia, but the evidence of history demonstrates that they had no link to the Holy Land or Palestine. The greater irony lies in the fact that significant numbers of Palestinians driven from their ancestral homes over the past 100 years were likely to have been descendants of the original Jews of that land who converted to Islam following the Muslim conquests of the Levant in the first half of the 7th century. Eran El-Haik, an Israeli geneticist who served 7 years in the Israeli Defense Force and no critic of Israel, developed genome studies at Johns Hopkins universities. In tracing the geographical positioning of a number of Ashkenazim Jews, he found that their ancestral origins were not from the Middle East or indeed the Mediterranean, but from a region that is now in northeast Turkey. This scientific evidence underscores the historical findings of Shlomo Sand and others that makes nonsense of the claims of an ancestral Jewish homeland and the diaspora. According to the chapter, British policymakers invoked biblical and symbolic language about a Jewish homeland in Palestine that modern historians would challenge. This matters because those same terms were later used to justify concrete political commitments during the war. The Balfour Declaration, issued on November 2, 1917 by Arthur Balfour, is presented not as a spontaneous moral gesture, but as the product of years of lobbying by influential Zionist figures in Britain and the United States. Key supporters within the British establishment, including Alfred Milner and Leo Amery, viewed a Jewish national home as strategically useful. The final wording of the Declaration emerged through extensive correspondence between the British government and figures such as Walter Rothschild, Chaim Weizmann, and the Zionist Federation. The chapter also emphasizes that the Declaration had American approval, backed by Woodrow Wilson and strongly supported by Louis Brandeis. The authors distinguish between early religious Zionism and a more political, territorial Zionism, championed by a small but determined group seeking a Jewish state in Palestine. During the war, this group leveraged Britain's desperation and America's entry into the conflict to advance long-term goals unrelated to ending the war quickly. The chapter concludes that the Balfour Declaration was less about humanitarian concern and more about strategic calculation, wartime leverage, and ideological ambition, its consequences far outlasting the conflict that enabled it. Chapter 28 argues that the Balfour Declaration was not born of ancient destiny, but of modern war, lobbying, and power. Chapter 29. The Balfour Declaration, Perfidious Albion. Chapter 29 places the Balfour Declaration within the web of contradictory promises Britain made during the war. At its outset, the Middle East was a patchwork of peoples and loyalties under Ottoman rule. Palestine itself was overwhelmingly Arab, with Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities living side by side. Seeking to prevent an Ottoman-led jihad and secure regional stability, Britain promised Arab leaders support for an independent Arab state in exchange for rebellion against Ottoman rule. At the same time, however, British officials secretly negotiated a very different agreement with France, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, to divide the Ottoman territories between European powers. Arab interests had no meaningful representation in London, while strategic and financial priorities dominated decision-making. Senior officials warned of the dangers. Papers questioning Zionist claims to Palestine, concerns about the rights of the existing population, and objections from British administrators with deep regional knowledge were all raised and then ignored. When Balfour Declaration was issued, Arthur Balfour reassured colleagues that it did not immediately imply a Jewish state, but left the future deliberately ambiguous. Zionist leaders celebrated the declaration, while warnings that conflicting promises would lead to long-term disaster went unheeded. Following the declaration, political and institutional momentum accelerated. Zionist organizations moved quickly to establish cultural and educational foundations in Palestine, ensuring they would have standing when post-war peace negotiations began. Financial backing, particularly from influential banking families, played a key role. The chapter concludes that Britain's support for Zionism was driven less by moral commitment than by imperial calculation. Control of territory near the Suez Canal and along routes to India and Persia mattered more than consistency or justice. By promising the same land to different peoples, Britain laid the foundations for conflict whose consequences would long outlive the war itself. Chapter 29 argues that Britain's greatest deception was not a single promise, but making several, knowing they could never all be kept. When the war finally ended, it was said that peace had been won, but what was really secured was control. America entered the war too late to suffer its costs, yet early enough to shape its outcome, not as a conqueror in uniform, but as an arbiter, deciding which empires would fall, which promises would be honored, and which peoples would discover that independence was little more than a word on a paper. The Middle East was not betrayed because of confusion or incompetence. It was betrayed because overlapping promises created leverage, and leverage creates dependence. Wilson's ideals did not fail. They were never meant to apply universally. They provided moral cover while borders were drawn, mandates were imposed, and the foundations of permanent instability were laid. The war did not end in 1918. It simply changed form. What followed was a century of managed disorder, inherited conflicts, and unfinished promises, all traceable to decisions made in private rooms, while the world was still exhausted from war.